The rope lies coiled like a serpent at rest, deceptively ordinary in the filtered sunlight that dapples the Fijian earth. But in these islands where the sea whispers ancient secrets to the shore, this simple cord once carried the weight of tradition and finality, an instrument of devotion and death. When a chief's soul departed for the shadowy realm beyond, his widow would feel this rope tighten around her neck, drawing her after him into darkness, her loyalty measured in her final gasping moments. They called it loloku, widow strangling, a practice that bound women to men even beyond the threshold of death. The strangling cord is the first thing that a Fijian woman prepares as a gift for her husband's household upon marriage, wrote anthropologist A.M. Hocart in his 1929 Field Notes, a brutally pragmatic wedding gift that might ultimately seal her own fate. In the tangled mangrove swamps and volcanic highlands of pre-colonial Fiji, death was never a solitary journey. Some souls required companions. When Ratu Seru Kakobau, one of Fiji's most powerful chiefs, died in 1883, 5 of his wives prepared to follow him into the afterlife. Though Christian missionaries had spent decades working to end this practice, the customs persisted in the shadows of colonial rule. The wives' relatives arrived, bearing the strangling cord, a twisted length of tapa cloth or coconut fiber, worn smooth from generations of ceremonial use. Those who would perform the deed were called lingavatu, stone rollers, for the weight of their responsibility. The oldest of Kakabau's wives stepped forward first. She sat upright, adorned in her finest tapa cloth and whale tooth necklaces, her skin glistening with scented coconut oil. Her face betrayed no fear as the cord was placed around her neck. According to witnesses, she called out to her gods and ancestors as 2 men pulled the cord tight from opposite sides. Her body became a bridge between worlds, a vessel emptying itself to complete one final obligation. British colonial administrator Sir Arthur Gordon, who witnessed similar ceremonies in the late 19th century, wrote, "The widow sits with her head bowed and shoulders hunched, assuming a posture that facilitates the act. There is rarely any struggle. The calmness with which these women face their death is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire ritual." The sky above remained indifferent. The azure Pacific continued its endless percussion against the reef, and somewhere in the village, a new widow began weaving her own strangling cord. The origins of loloku are buried beneath layers of time and oral history. Like twisted mangrove roots sinking into brackish water, the practice entangled itself with Fijian beliefs about the afterlife, social hierarchy, and a woman's position within the clan structure. The earliest European observers in the late 18th century found the custom already firmly established. The Fijian cosmos is populated by demanding ancestral spirits, explains historian Dr. Martha Kaplan of Vassar College. The dead require attendance and service just as they did in life. A chief's journey to the spirit world was treacherous, requiring companions, servants, and wives to see to his comfort. The practice existed within a broader cultural context where death was not merely an end, but a transition requiring precise ritual management. Archaeological evidence suggests that servant sacrifice accompanied chiefly deaths for centuries before European contact. In the hierarchical Fijian society, a paramount chief's status demanded that his passage be appropriately marked, his canoe to the afterlife properly provisioned with possessions and companions. In traditional Fijian cosmology, writes anthropologist Nicholas Thomas, the individual did not exist apart from their social relationships. Death did not sever these bonds, but transformed them. The widow's sacrifice was the ultimate expression of this continuity. Like shadows stretching longer as the sun descends, the practice extended across much of the Fijian archipelago, though with regional variations. In some areas, only the highest-ranking wife would be strangled. In others, All wives were expected to follow their husband. The sky over these islands hangs heavy with paradox. How could such tenderness and cruelty exist in the same cultural breath? Not all widows went quietly. Colonial records and missionary accounts describe women who fled into the bush when their husbands lay dying, seeking sanctuary with Christian communities. Others were forcibly dragged back to fulfill their obligation. Yet many women apparently embraced their fate, believing that refusal would lead to supernatural punishment or eternal separation from their husbands in the afterlife. Missionary James Calvert wrote in 1858, "I have seen several women actually force the rope around their own necks, pulling it tight with their own hands, while family members wept around them. The fear of living on as a widow, ostracized, finger-pointed, suspected of having caused the husband's death through witchcraft, was sometimes greater than the fear of the strangling cord." The ritual was typically performed by the woman's own brothers or male relatives from her birth clan, creating a circle of obligation that bound family to family. This was not considered murder, but a sacred duty, the fulfillment of promises made when the marriage was arranged. The process itself was grimly efficient. The cord was placed around the neck, crossed at the back, and pulled from both sides simultaneously. Death came within minutes. The body was then prepared and buried alongside the husband, often positioned so that the wife's hand might rest on his chest or shoulder for eternity. Dr. Damon Salisa, Pacific historian at the University of Auckland, explains, "These customs cannot be understood through a simple lens of oppression. They existed within complex social systems where women had defined roles and certain kinds of power, even as they were ultimately subordinate to men. The practice reflected the extreme expression of a society where connection to others defined one's existence. In the dry season, when the trade winds sculpt the clouds into galleons sailing across the Fijian sky, one might imagine the spirits of these women still drifting through the pandanus groves, their loyalty preserved in the cultural memory of these islands like insects trapped in amber." When Methodist missionary William Cross first witnessed the preparation for a widow strangling in 1838, he described it as the most horrid and terrific scene I had ever witnessed. The clash between traditional Fijian practices and Christian values became immediate and intense. The European missionaries arrived with their black coats buttoned tight against what they viewed as tropical depravity, their leather-bound Bibles held like shields. They were met with a cultural logic they could not comprehend, where a woman's greatest honor might lie in her willingness to die with dignity when her husband passed. Reverend Thomas Williams wrote in his 1858 account, "Fiji and the Fijians. The strangling of widows is perhaps the most revolting feature of Fijian customs. I have labored with chiefs as they prepared to order the deaths of their brothers' widows, only to be told that it would be the greatest unkindness to let them live. They believed these women would be brutally treated in the spirit world if they arrived without their husbands." The missionaries' efforts to end the practice met with mixed success. Some chiefs who converted to Christianity banned widows strangling in their territories. Others maintained the custom in secret. The social pressure on women remained immense, with families sometimes threatening suicide themselves if a widow refused to follow her husband. It is a mistake to see these women as merely passive victims, argues anthropologist Christina Toran. Many believed sincerely in the cosmology that demanded their sacrifice. They faced death not with resignation, but with a sense of purpose and continuation. This cultural chasm, where one society saw murder and another saw sacred obligation, epitomized the fundamental misunderstandings that characterized colonial encounters throughout the Pacific. The missionaries' horror at widow strangling was genuine, but so was the Fijians' horror at the thought of sending a chief into the afterlife alone and unattended. The practice dwindled over decades rather than disappearing overnight. Like a tide reluctantly receding, it withdrew first from coastal areas with the strongest missionary presence, lingering longer in the mountainous interior of the larger islands. By the time Fiji became a British colony in 1874, widow strangling had been officially outlawed but continued in remote areas. Colonial administrators found themselves in the uncomfortable position of punishing what local communities saw as acts of devotion rather than crimes. The last documented case occurred in 1891 on the northern island of Vanuatu, where a chief's death triggered the strangling of 3 wives despite the prohibition. The men who performed the act were tried and imprisoned by colonial authorities, creating martyrs in the eyes of traditionalists. Colonial Secretary for Fiji, Sir Everard Mthurn, wrote in his journal, "The men we imprisoned seemed genuinely baffled by our interference. These women were not yours," they told the magistrate. "They belonged to the chief. How could you claim the right to keep them from following him?" As Fiji moved into the 20th century, the practice receded into cultural memory. Today, it exists only in historical accounts, anthropological studies, and the whispered stories passed down through generations. But the psychological imprint remains, a complex legacy that raises questions about agency, belief, and the nature of devotion. The colonial narrative portrayed these women as helpless victims, notes Pacific historian Dr. Teresia Teaiwa. But this denies them the dignity of their choices within their cultural context. Many went to their deaths believing they were fulfilling their highest purpose. Like a storm that has passed but left the landscape forever altered, the memory of Loloku continues to shape discussions about Fijian history, gender relations, and cultural identity. The strangling cord has been unraveled, but the questions it poses about loyalty, belief, and cultural relativism remain knotted and complex. The written record preserves fragments of these women's final moments. In 1845, Methodist missionary Thomas Jagger documented the strangling of Samoanica, wife of a chief, on Viti Levu. She decorated herself carefully as if for a festival. As they placed the cord around her neck, she began to sing what I was told was a traditional death chant. Her voice remained steady until the end, when it was cut off mid-verse. The assembled crowd seemed moved but not surprised, as if witnessing something as natural as the setting sun. The cultural logic that allowed, even demanded, such deaths operated within a worldview where the boundary between the living and dead was permeable, where ancestors remained active participants in community affairs, and where a person's status in the afterlife reflected their status in life. Anthropologist Marshall Salins observed, "The Fijian self was not contained within the boundaries of the individual body, but extended outward through relationships. A chief's wife was not merely connected to him, her identity was constituted through that connection. To survive him would be, in a sense, to become incomplete." This interconnectedness extended to the physical world as well. The same hands that wove mats for daily use wove strangling cords. The same relatives who celebrated marriages conducted the strangling. The same community that welcomed a bride prepared her body for burial years later when her husband died. "There is a terrible intimacy to the act," wrote Lady Gordon, wife of Fiji's first colonial governor, after interviewing elderly women who had witnessed widow stranglings in their youth. "The person who pulls the cord is often someone who has loved the woman since childhood, a brother, an uncle, a cousin. They weep even as they pull, believing they are sending her to a better place." The cord itself became a metaphor for the binding social obligations that structured Fijian society, obligations that could nurture and sustain, but also constrict and destroy. What thoughts passed through a woman's mind as she prepared for her own strangling? Historical accounts suggest a complex psychological landscape, neither simple submission nor unalloyed terror, but something more nuanced. From childhood, High-born Fijian women were raised with the knowledge that they might one day be called to follow their husbands in death. This awareness shaped their understanding of marriage, loyalty, and their own worth. Some historical accounts describe young girls practicing for death, sitting with straight backs and extended necks, learning to face their final moments with composure. The preparation was lifelong, explains psychological anthropologist Dr. Ann Becker. These women internalized cultural values that prioritize devotion to one's husband above self-preservation. What appears as fatalism to outside observers may have been experienced internally as fulfilling one's highest purpose. Some women reportedly took pride in their willingness to die, seeing it as the ultimate proof of their status and character. Others accepted it as simply the natural order of things, no more questionable than the cycle of seasons or the pull of tides. Missionary accounts describe widows who appeared to enter trance-like states before their strangling, perhaps aided by kava or other ritual substances. Others maintained lucid awareness, speaking calmly to those around them until the moment the cord tightened. In his 1862 account, British consul William Pritchard described a widow who spent her final hours giving detailed instructions to her daughter about household management and family obligations. She spoke with such practical concern about mundane matters, the proper time to harvest yams which relatives could be trusted, how to weave a particular pattern, that one might have thought she was merely preparing for a journey, not her own death. Perhaps, in her understanding, she was. The psychological burden fell not only on the women, but on those tasked with performing the strangling. These men, often the woman's own brothers, carried the weight of this duty throughout their lives. Some reports describe Lingavatu who could never speak of what they had done, who woke in the night feeling phantom cords in their hands. The cultural logic demanded this sacrifice, notes psychological historian Dr. James Cote, but the human psyche is complex enough to both accept a practice as necessary and still feel the trauma of participation. The strangler and the strangled were both constrained by cultural imperatives that transcended individual will. In the silence between heartbeats, in the space between one breath and the next, these women made their final crossing, from person to memory, from individual to ancestor, from the warm complexity of life to whatever lay beyond. Though widow strangling has been absent from Fiji for over a century, its cultural echoes reverberate through contemporary Fijian society. The practice exists now as metaphor, as cautionary tale, as a complicated thread in the tapestry of national identity. Modern Fijian women sometimes reference it when discussing the evolution of gender roles. Our great-grandmothers died with their husbands, a Fijian feminist scholar told an interviewer in 2005. We no longer follow them in death, but sometimes I wonder if we still sacrifice too much of ourselves in marriage. The practice has become a potent symbol in discussions about cultural relativism, colonial intervention, and the evolution of traditional practices. For some, it represents the most extreme expression of a patriarchal system that valued women primarily as accessories to men. For others, it demonstrates the danger of judging historical practices by contemporary standards. We cannot understand Loloku by imposing modern Western values on historical Fijian society, argues cultural historian Dr. Viliame Kagivinaka. This doesn't mean accepting or endorsing the practice, but recognizing that it existed within a complete cultural system with its own internal logic and meaning. Tourism materials and popular accounts of Fijian history often sanitize or entirely omit references to widow strangling, focusing instead on more palatable aspects of traditional culture. This selective remembering creates a version of the past that is easier to consume, but fails to honor the complexity of human experience. There is a kind of violence in forgetting, suggests post-colonial scholar Dr. Sudesh Mishra. When we erase difficult aspects of cultural history, we deny the full humanity of those who lived through it, their struggles, their beliefs, their choices, however constrained those choices might have been. In contemporary Fiji, where Christianity has become deeply integrated into cultural identity, the practice is often discussed as evidence of how far society has progressed. Church services sometimes reference it when celebrating the transformative power of Christian faith in the islands. Yet in private conversations, in the spaces between official narratives, older Fijians may speak of these customs with a complex mixture of distance and connection, acknowledging the obvious brutality while contextualizing it within broader cultural systems that provided meaning and structure to their ancestors' lives. Like a shadow that lengthens and distorts as the day progresses, the memory of widow strangling stretches across time, changing shape but never quite disappearing from the landscape of Fijian cultural consciousness. The practice of widow strangling in Fiji presents us with uncomfortable truths about human societies. It demonstrates how systems of meaning can normalize extreme behaviors, how devotion and destruction can intertwine, how agency operates within cultural constraints. What appears barbaric to outside observers may be experienced as sacred by participants, notes anthropologist Dr. Martha McIntyre. This doesn't make such practices immune from ethical critique, but it should give us pause before assuming we fully understand their meaning and function. The story of widow strangling is not simply one of oppression, though power and gender certainly played crucial roles. It is also about belief systems, social cohesion, status, and the human capacity to find meaning even in death. It challenges neat categories and easy judgments. As Fiji continues to navigate between traditional values and modern realities, the memory of these strangled widows serves as a complex inheritance, a reminder of how far society has come and how cultural practices, even the most extreme, exist within systems rather than in isolation. Historical documentation preserves fragments of these women's stories, their names, their final words, their composure, or resistance in death. What remains unrecorded is equally significant: their private thoughts, their silent fears, their understanding of their own place in the cosmos that demanded their sacrifice. For the modern reader, the practice may seem unimaginably distant, a relic from a different world. Yet the fundamental questions it raises remain relevant. How do we balance individual autonomy against cultural expectations? How do belief systems shape our understanding of life's value? How do we honor historical truths while affirming universal human rights? The strangling cord has been unraveled, wrote Fijian poet Konai Helu Taman, but we remain bound by invisible threads to those who came before. In the end, perhaps the most profound legacy of these strangled widows is the questions their stories continue to raise, questions that coil around our understanding of culture, choice, gender, and the powerful grip of belief on human behavior. The last recorded widow strangling in Fiji occurred generations ago, yet in the whispering palms and on the wind-brushed hills, something remains. Not the practice itself, but the memory of women who, for reasons we may struggle to comprehend, accepted the tightening cord as their due. Their final breaths have long since dissolved into the Pacific air, but the echo lingers, challenging us to look beyond simple narratives of victim and oppressor, tradition and modernity, loyalty and submission.